Good evening, church. Man, I need Drew to go with me everywhere I go to speak. Hey, I just saw somebody I know. Yeah, that was. I mean, it's all downhill from here after that kind of an introduction. But I want to just say thank you so much for having me. I'm like Drew said, I'm from. We've ministered in Columbia now for going on 18 years, and that's a little bit of a drive, but my daughters were like, hey, let's do a road trip today. So I have 3 daughters with me here tonight, and I'm glad that we got a little time to spend together on the drive up. I really do appreciate Drew a lot. As he mentioned, we haven't gotten to spend a whole lot of time together, but here and there when we have, we really are, I think, kindred spirits in a lot of ways. I love the way Drew thinks, and I'm so appreciative of the long, ongoing, consistent ministry that he has had at a wonderful congregation, and I'm so appreciative of this congregation and all that this church is doing in this area. But it goes beyond that. I got a couple of little connections here from that kind of go beyond the ministry staff. I'm friends with Hunter Kinnaman, your former youth minister, and we have also a couple of connections. Because you're a young man who is a former member of the youth group here, is actually our current youth minister at Highland. That's Wesley McGehee. And Wesley is doing an outstanding job at Highland. And I cannot brag on him enough because his mama's sitting right back there. And that's who I just saw. And I love her too. And we're so thankful for him being with us. And I know you all are proud of him and what he's doing. And more than that, Eli Mann was a member of our youth group at Highland. And he grew up in our youth group, and now he's here ministering at this congregation. And I love Eli. Eli has a heart of gold, man. And his dad actually was one of our elders for a time before he had to move away for his job. But anyway, I got a deep respect for this congregation. Love Eli, appreciate the work he's doing. Love Drew, appreciate the work he's doing. And I'm thankful for your contribution to our ministry through our youth minister. All right. Let's all turn in our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 16 tonight as we study the Word of God for just a minute. The person of King David. That's my assignment. I have the Song of David that was given to me as a topic. I love this topic. I love the theme. 1 Samuel 18:7. The occasion is the women are singing a song of celebration because of a victory in battle. And here is the song. The women sang, verse 7, as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Notice the beginning of the next verse. And Saul became very angry. David, what a figure in your Bible. As you think about if you think about just in terms of a Bible timeline, think in terms of great themes of the Bible, biblical theology, you start to think about the creation narrative, then you think about people, we know the story of the fall in Genesis 3, then we know the story of the flood where there was sort of this, just climactic event in the flood, and on the other side of that, there was the building of the Tower of Babel, a competing empire, we might say, with the kingdom of God. From there, God decided instead of just kicking the world to pieces once again, He created a rescue team through the bloodline of a man named Abram. Abram had sons. Those sons grew up to be very influential in the faith for Yahweh as well, especially one in particular comes to mind, Joseph, one of that lineage, rises to be second in command of all Egypt. But there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. The people were enslaved. God raised up Moses to deliver the people once again. But they end up, once they're delivered, wandering for about 40 years in the wilderness. And on the other side of that, there's this series of wars and battles and skirmishes. The times of the judges kind of ensues during that era. You may recall all of that, right? And the judges, man, what a time. And so a lot of the people of God, they're not very unified. They have some things in common with especially with their faith. But the reality is they wanted an earthly king they could see and follow and hear and commune with. And so God raised up the great, I I love Samuel. And so the story of Samuel is just awesome. Those first sections in the book of 1 Samuel are all about him, and also he is the one who selects that first king for the people of God known as Saul, the guy we just read about that got really mad about our main idea here tonight. But that leads us then to the person of David, and the David that we read about in Scripture, his shadow looms very heavily over all of biblical history. Out of 104 chapters in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, his life and his story dominates 42 out of those chapters, 42 out of 104 chapters. That's a lot of storyline about King David. And I want us to think about David's life and really what surrounds this song of victory that we just read about just a minute ago. Let's start out with some things about David, some inaccuracies, maybe it's better to say overemphases. Can we do that? So when we think about the life of David, what are the two things we always talk about and bring up? Anybody? Can I ask questions? I don't know. What's that? What are the two things that we think about with David in his life? We talk about it all the time. Goliath and what? Bathsheba. Those are the two that always come to mind. And it's not a bad thing to talk about those two things. I think we should talk about them. We are going to talk about at least one of them tonight. But when you think about that, that's one chapter, the story of David and Goliath, out of 42 in the entire history of his life. And a lot of the circumstances surrounding that battle, we often get wrong. One of which we'll talk about in a minute, that David was not a child when he fought Goliath. We'll come circling back to that in just a moment. The other is the story of Bathsheba and just all of the palace intrigue that goes into that story, especially when you think about who Bathsheba's husband was. I don't know that we've often thought about his position in the court of David, but there's a lot of things going on here. And that story as well is only 2 chapters out of 42. There are a lot of layers to the story of David. Have y'all ever seen these things? I love these little puzzles like this. They're kind of, I don't know, visual or optical. Illusion's not the right word. Maybe somebody can help me with this. This is actually the cover of the Anchor Buggy Company from like 1905 or something like that. I can't quite see the date on it. And the interesting thing about this is one of the first widely published optical illusions on a cover of a print document. So do you see why it's sort of an optical illusion? Some of you, maybe you see a side portrait of an older lady. Some of you maybe see the silhouette there, an outline of a younger woman who seems to be turning away. I wonder how many of you can actually see both of them. It's always funny when I bring this up, if I use this in a sermon and people are looking around like, I don't see the younger lady, or I don't see the older lady. And I think the key is the ear or the eye. And if you'll think about what I just said, you'll get it. When you think about this particular idea and the optical illusion, there are layers to this kind of thing. When you think about the life and person of King David, there's so many layers to his life. It's pretty complex. And what I want to talk about for just a minute are some of the interesting unknowns about the life of David. Did you know David was the great-grandson of Ruth, who has a book in the Bible dedicated to her, and she's from Moab. She is actually called a Na'arah, a person of great status from the land of Moab. And when David is on the run, running for his life, he actually finds asylum for a time through the king of Moab. Little interesting tidbit. Did you know that Saul wanted to kill his own son Jonathan because he had established such a tight and beautiful friendship with David himself? Did you know that Saul offered David the hand of his daughter multiple times? David actually either earned or was offered the hand of one of Saul's daughters, Michal or Merab, whichever one, depending on the event. Did you know that David had a group of mercenaries that were fiercely loyal to him? They were the mighty men of valor, and David could trust these men not only to protect him during the era in which he was on the run, but especially after that as well. Did you know David is the one who kind of solidifies and makes the city of Jerusalem home base for the people of God. We could almost call Jerusalem Davidsburg, right? Give it a little flair to it. The idea is that it is David's city. He's the one that establishes it. He kind of solidifies all of the surrounding territories and brings them under a unified banner, which lasts for about 100 years. Did you know Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, was actually a very important person in David's cabinet? He was no common soldier. He's actually a high-ranking officer, a commander, and he is mentioned in David's Hall of Fame, the 37 dear warriors in the life of David. Did you know that David had 6 or 7, depending on the count, sons, all born to different queens? A lot of palace intrigue going on there we don't often talk about. Did you know that David actually named a son Nathan after the time when Nathan the prophet confronted him about his sin with Bathsheba, which tells you a little bit something about how David felt about that confrontation itself. And lastly, did you know that one of David's mighty men by the name of Abishai rescued him from being slain by another giant at a different point in his life? There's lots of, just very interesting side stories and cul-de-sacs in the life of David. What I want to do for just a minute is, you got your Bible open to 1 Samuel 16. I want to look at the rise of David and what led to the singing of this song that we just looked at a moment ago. And I want to focus first of all on 1 Samuel chapter 16, beginning of verse 6. It says, when they came, he, that is Samuel, he's looking for a new individual to anoint. And he looked on Eliab. Eliab is an older brother of David, and he's a lot bigger. And he looks the part because of that, right? And he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And he sent, verse 12, and brought him in. Now this is David. This is a description to David. Ready? He was ruddy, had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. Man, I hate him already. What about you? He's ruddy. He's tanned. He's got this outdoorish kind of complexion to him. He's got these beautiful eyes, and he's handsome. And Samuel is ready to anoint him as the uncrowned king, which is a very poorly kept secret in the land. Now, this is a very important description that comes about David later on. You heard Drew read this at the beginning of the Devo tonight. So, Saul has a very troubled heart, and he wants someone to come in who's a skilled musician and can play in order to soothe his spirit, play that music in order to soothe his spirit. And I want you to notice carefully, scholars, I want you to notice carefully what the text actually says about David way before David ever encountered Goliath. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 16, there in verse 18, one of the young men answered, we have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, but not just that. Ready for this? He's a man of valor, and what else? What's next? A man of war. Does that sound like a fourth grader to you, by the way? He's a man of valor. He's a man of war. He is prudent in speech. He carries himself with confidence. Most importantly, and the reason we should love David the most, the Lord is with him. I think that's the thing I love about David the most is he lives this life of incredible adventure. But the reality is he's interesting to us primarily because he was a man after God's own heart. And I want to be that in my life, don't you? I want to be a person who's after the things that God is after, and for him to look at me in that way. So from these descriptions, I think we could say, it's safe to say, David was not, as we often have depicted in Sunday school, pictures and maybe some of the ideas in our head. David was not a small boy running around, encountering this great giant. There's a lot more to him. And what I find interesting, look at 1 Samuel, drop back a couple of chapters to chapter 14. Notice the tendency of Saul. 1 Samuel 14, verse 52, it says, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and now watch this is key. When Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him unto himself. Now what that means is David is going to be, because he is already a man of valor and a man of war, he's going to be a very attractive addition to the court of King Saul. And in fact, there is I don't want to lose you here, this is very important. There's a very important word that is used in connection with David. He is called in the Hebrew text a Na'ar. And I want to talk about that for a moment because some of the older translations translate Na'ar as lad or boy, and that's where we sometimes, I think, maybe get kind of this idea that how young he was. He was young, but not as young as we think. But Na'ar has a far deeper and more meaningful and complex meaning. Na'ar means he was an elite armor bearer. If that verse we looked at says he's a man of war, that means at this point in his life, he is a Na'ar. He's a warrior in training. He's not yet achieved knight status, we might say, but he's on his way. And this is very important. So let's look at, go back to chapter 16 again. 1 Samuel 16:21. David came to Saul. Remember, Saul wants to attract any man of valor unto himself. And he entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly. Ahava me'od. He loved him deeply. He thought David was the perfect addition to his court staff. Now look at the end of verse 21. And he became Saul's, and I wonder what your translation does with this, he became Saul's Na'ar, his armor bearer, his warrior in training, his knight in training. This is very important, very, very important. So I had the blessing of having two of the greatest teachers I could have ever hoped for in my life when I was at Lipscomb. I had Harvey Floyd, who taught about 60 years, taught Greek, in just a master of the Greek text. And I also had Rodney Cloud. He was my Hebrew teacher. By the way, he's still, at 93 years old, the dean at the Bible department at Amherst University, still teaching Hebrew. Pretty impressive. Back in 1972, he stood virtually alone in talking about the true meaning of this word Na'ar. By 1976, a lot of scholars had begun coming around, worldwide, to this understanding of sort of an armor bearer or having to do with status, okay? And now, if you go to any kind of online, very academic journal, you will find multiple articles written about this word. It does not mean lad. It does not mean merely boy or something like that. It carries with it something very important having to do with status. Now, let me give you, before I bore you to death, let me give you an illustration of this. Joseph, when he is running away from Potiphar's wife, at this stage in his life, he is called a Na'ar, same word used for David. And Joseph is around 17 years old at this time. He's not a little boy running around. And in essence, this usage of this word in Joseph's life means he's sort of the crown prince. He holds a very important status in that place. All right, so we go back to this description. He's skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, man of good presence. Most importantly, the Lord is with him. All right, so let's look now at 1 Samuel 17. Notice what David says. So we got this impending, looming battle between the people of God and the Philistines. And nobody wants to come to the plate. Nobody wants to face Goliath. More on him in a moment. The Philistines were an ugly people. They worshipped various pagan deities. Dagon, the fish god, was one of them that they frequented. Nobody wants to have this combat with the Philistines. And David is there to see to his family sees his own brothers not being brave enough to stay. His own brothers who are already conscripted in the army. David's not there yet. Why? Because he's the youngest. Somebody's got to stay back and take care of the farm. All of his older brothers have gone on to join the army. None of them are stepping up to the plate. David's ready to go. David believes he can handle the situation. Why? Because he believes the Lord is with him. Remember that description we just read about. He believes wholeheartedly that the Lord will see him through it. And as part of pleading his case, look in your 1 Samuel 17, verses 34 and following, where he says, in essence, as I've been tending to the flock, I have defended against the lion and against the bear, and the Lord will deliver me from the hands of this pagan Philistine. And don't you love his confidence? Don't you love that? This is very interesting. If you go back to roughly around the time, a little before the time of David, we can, in the realm of archaeology, we found some reliefs which depict various scenarios where, maybe military men or forces have encountered wild animals. Some of them depict battles against lions. We don't really know what type of bear they had in that particular region. We don't have any surviving reliefs or depictions like this. They're extinct, long extinct now. But David says, I can handle it. And we believe it. Now, Saul relents and allows him to go into battle Goliath. And to do so, he offers to David his armor. Now, does anybody remember why was it that the people really wanted Saul as their king? Does anybody remember there was one defining characteristic that everybody looked at Saul and said, that's our guy? Remember? Yeah, he was a whole head taller than everybody else. Now imagine armor created specifically for Saul. And David trying to wear that. How unwieldy that possibly could have been. And David decided, it's not because he's some little boy running around, it's because Saul's just a whole head taller than everybody else. And so David decides he's going to stick with the things he knows. And what are the things he knows? More on that in a moment. Let's think about his opponent for a second. If you look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 33, we're introduced to the infamous enemy of David, known as Goliath. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. Why? You are but, we have a cognate here of a young warrior in training, but he has been a man of war since he was young. So let's get the picture here. Everybody listen to what I'm about to say. The idea that Saul has is, this is the heavyweight champion of the world. You're not even ranked. You're in the amateurs. What good is it for you to try to take on the world champion? And Goliath himself feels that way. If you look in 1 Samuel 17:42, Goliath sees David. Look at, he gets really upset. No doubt he expected a very worthy appearing opponent. Who could have been some of the possible opponents for Goliath? I can think of one right out of the gate. Who's the king of the land? You ready for that guy to go there? Surely the Lord's with that guy, right? He's a whole head taller than everybody else, got his own special custom armor, ready to go to battle. No, he's not out there. If you look at verse 42, you'll see that Goliath interprets David's presence as mockery because all he is Saul's armor bearer, a warrior in training. Look at 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. There came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. I don't know what that means. Let me tell you why. A cubit was measured by the length of the forearm. And you see some various details about that. The problem with knowing what that meant is that human beings have been growing over hundreds of years, even thousands of years. They've been getting bigger. And so it's kind of hard for us to really sort of nail down. The point is, he's huge, okay? He's a really big guy. I don't know about you. I grew up, I had these dreams when I was got married. I was like, I'm going to raise a preacher. I'm going to have a son. God gave me 3 daughters. Now, I'm an only child, And I'm convinced God was teaching me a lot of really cool life lessons by giving me 3 daughters. I would never want anything else. They're the best. They are so much fun. One of the things about getting to watch them grow up, we got to watch a lot of cool movies together. Here's one, The Princess Bride. Man, what an entertaining movie. A lot of memorable scenes in that movie, right? And there's one guy who kind of stands out because of obvious physical characteristics. Some of y'all know who this guy is, though, apart from the movie The Princess Bride. His name is, and probably it's the older folks saying that, because we watched him in WWF back in the day. 7'4", 500 pounds, okay? Undefeated for about 30 years in a wrestling ring. They'd throw him in a battle royal with, whatever it is, 29 other people, and he'd just toss them all over the top rope. End of the story, right? And you just think about his life. His life is just almost that of a cartoon character. You got random pictures of him, here play punching Muhammad Ali, lifting, I guess, if you're Andre the Giant, you just go around lifting cars up, all the time. He had a hard life in many ways. He didn't fit in a lot of places, which made it very difficult for him. But even in our own experience, we've at least seen on television individuals that we say, man, that guy is on another level. And whatever else we may say about Goliath, we would have to say this man is on another level. There's something about him that's incredibly impressive as a combatant. You go back to that verse 5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, armed with a coat of mail. Listen to this. The weight of his coat of mail is around 220 pounds. Now, some of y'all weigh maybe 200 pounds. Just imagine just carrying one of yourself on your shoulders into the battlefield. I mean, that's a lot of weight. This guy, and then he's carrying around this spear that the head of it alone weighed 600 shekels. And notice the last line there in verse 7. His shield bearer went before him. Did you catch that? Goliath has his own armor bearer. And Israel is sending out an armor bearer to fight him. How insulting would that seem to him? So let's talk about the battle for a minute that leads to the song. I grew up on Locks Creek in Woodbury, Tennessee. It's about, 30 minutes southeast of Murfreesboro, which is about, Murfreesboro, yeah, that's right, which is about 45 to 50 minutes southeast of Nashville. And one of my favorite things was to get a slingshot like this, because that's what we had back then. I try to explain this. We had rotary phones, y'all, right? Rotary phones, cassette tapes. That was our Spotify, was cassette tapes, right? And if you think David was a little boy, or you thought that he was, you might have also thought this was his sling. The reality is, in those days, in the ancient Near East, there were lots of armies which carried entire segments of the army which were known as slingers. And you had these various waves of combatants which would assault an opposing army. Most all wars would start out, if they were at any kind of distance, would start out with bow and arrow. And they would try to take them out. But somewhere back of them, as the distance would close, they had all of these slingers that would come in. And here's what their sling looked like. You can see a kind of replica there in the upper left-hand corner. You would take these two long strips of leather and attach a pouch. And then you would set a smooth stone, maybe you made it smooth yourself, a little smaller than a baseball. And they would take that thing and they would sling it like this. And then they would release it by pointing. There's something cool about thinking about David being out taking care of the sheep and just target practicing with that thing all the time, You see in the lower left-hand corner, one of the stones that would have been used in this kind of a weapon compared to a man's hand. Have y'all ever been to a baseball game and seen somebody get beamed in the face with a baseball? What happens when that guy gets hit? What happens to him 9 times out of 10? He falls flat on his face, right? Or he falls backwards, whatever it is. Now imagine that baseball, a little smaller, but it's made of stone, and it's traveling at roughly 120 miles an hour as it's being slung out of this ancient weapon. What do you think that would do to a person? More on that in a moment. So one of the cool archaeological sites that my Hebrew teacher's been involved in is this place called Khirbet Qeiyafa. Khirbet Qeiyafa is important to us. You can actually go online to the Lanier Theological Library and watch a video on this. It is an excavated, I'm really going to bore you with some of this, okay? But I kind of like history. And this is a discovery of a fortified city that was highly likely to have been one of Saul's fortified cities at this time. Let me tell you why. The more you look at it, the more it fits the description and the timing. It has the Sha'arayim, which is the two gates. You have the southern gate, western gate. Why is that important? Well, this would have been the city where Saul was gathered, and they were getting ready for the battle with the Philistines. And David would have left out of this southern gate down into the valley, which you see in the far background of the picture. So David would have finished his conversation with Saul. He would have descended the mountain. He would have encountered the brook at the foot of this mountain, picked up his stones, and then he would have advanced into the valley of Elah to face Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, beginning of verse 44, the Philistines said to David, "Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds." And David, I love this, man. This gives me chills if I read it at the right time. It says, David says to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." Isn't that awesome? "And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head." Do you think David means business? And he says, "So that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, for the battle belongs to the Lord, and he will give you into our hand." And David put his hand into his bag, took out one of those smooth stones, and slung it. And notice what it did. It struck the Philistine in the forehead. Notice what the text said. Sank into his skull. What happens to him? He fell on his face to the ground. David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of the sheath, killed him, and cut off his head with it. David took the head, brought it to Jerusalem, and he pikes it. He puts it on the tip of a spear for everybody to see it. And he stows away his armor and his sword. Later on, he has to use this sword while he's on the run, interestingly enough. All the Philistines see this. They see their Andre the Giant just got whipped by an armor bearer, and they say, "Run for your lives." They start running. The people of God start pursuing, but the victory is won. David, he ascends once again to Khirbet Qeiyafa. Abner asks him, "Now hang on, whose son were you again? Tell us more about who you are." Don't you know they were very interested at that point? So David is called a man after God's own heart. I love that. When you think of what the meaning of heart is in the Hebrew Bible, it's not just feelings. It involves that, but also involves decisions you make. It involves choices and your process of thinking, the whole person. David loved God, but he was also willing to do what the Lord asked him to do. And this is precisely the kind of man that God wanted ruling over his people at this period of time. Well, let me run through just two things very quickly, and then we'll come to a last idea that will take about 5 minutes. Can y'all hang with me for just a minute? David is I don't want to go through this. David is the uncrowned but anointed king. There were various ways in the ancient Near East that kings could be anointed. A new king could come to power. Jonathan, who is the prince of the land, And the heir to the throne recognizes, in the midst of his friendship, that David is the anointed one, the Mashiach, that he will be the one who will rule over the people of God. We'll come back to that in a second. Saul tries to kill David. David goes on the run. A lot of interesting ways in which he tries to kill David. Don't have time to go into that. David survives because of his mighty men of valor. But eventually, through a lot of internal strife, civil war, David unifies the territories, establishes Jerusalem as, the city already existed, but he establishes that as home base. It becomes his home base and very important in the life of people. But as kings often do, he falls from grace in a very significant way with Bathsheba. Later on, his own son Absalom tries to usurp the throne. David laments in one of the Psalms. He's trying to crush my life, my kavod, my status, my importance, everything I've worked for the Lord. He's trying to crush it. And David grows into this seasoned warrior poet. In fact, if you let your Bible open, roughly in the middle, you'll find a book called the Psalms and the Psalter. David wrote about 73 of those. And they're beautiful. They're very helpful for our own faith. But I want to close out with the ultimate legacy of David. And I think it's cause for celebration. There is a covenant that God makes with David. It's called the Davidic covenant. And it's a promise from Yahweh that David would always have a descendant who sat on the throne of his kingdom. Now, during the years of the exile, there was a lot of questions about how it could possibly be. But the psalmist and many other places, especially in the kind of the intertestamental period, there's this growing expectation that God would send his anointed, promised king, son of David, to rescue his people from oppression. And so by the time we get to the arrival of Jesus, there is a little bit of an underswell of an expectation that God was going to rescue. Very interestingly, in Psalm 2 is called, oftentimes a section of it called a coronation psalm, because it's about God installing a new king over the people. And in this section, God says, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, and I will tell this decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. You are my son." Talking about this king over the people. Where have we heard this declaration from God before as New Testament Christians? Where have we heard God say, "You are my son"? Think about one occasion here. That's a declaration of who he is. So, any of you ever try to read through the Bible? You ever try to do one of these reading plans for the New Testament? I remember the first time I decided I was going to read through the New Testament, and I got to Matthew chapter 1, and I looked at this genealogy, and I was like, what in the world is this? I know this is the most exciting document that's ever been written on planet Earth, but why are we starting with this strange series of begats? What does chapter 1, verse 1 of Matthew say, though? The book of the genealogy of Jesus, the Christ, the Mashiach, the anointed. Now watch it. The son of who? Remember that Davidic covenant. And so throughout the book of Matthew, there are people constantly asking, could this be the son of David, the promised one who will come and rescue us? And what's the answer to that question? Absolutely. But he's rescuing at a level we never expected. Never understood, really, in a lot of ways. Until that final great act. Well, I want to close tonight and offer a little bit of an invitation, and I want to go back to the life of David to do it. David now in 2 Samuel 9, he has solidified the kingdom. And you remember his deep friendship with Jonathan? Remember that? His best friend in the world was the previous king's son. In the ancient Near East, if a new person arose to the throne from a different bloodline, the new king would execute everybody from the previous king's family. Why? So there would be no claimants to the throne that they were taking over. It would have been par for the course in that time for David to kill off all of Saul's remaining family. But David had a soft spot for his best friend Jonathan. Saul and Jonathan died, but there was a son of Jonathan named, does anybody remember his name? Mephibosheth. And in 2 Samuel 9, David encounters Mephibosheth. And he says to him, I'm going to restore to you all the land that your father possessed. And you will always have a seat at the king's table. I love that. I love that. Here is David looking at the son of his best friend, who, by the way, Mephibosheth he's crippled. He has no status on planet Earth. He owes him nothing except the love he had in his heart for the covenant that he had with Saul's son Jonathan. And he says to him, you will always have a place at my table. And there's something in that for us, I think. There's something in that for us because in our own way, we too lack status because of our own sin. But through Christ, the ultimate Son of David, we always have a place at the table of the King. Why would you ever want to pass that up? We're going to sing a song of invitation. I appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you for the honor of coming and speaking to you about eternal things. I don't want to diminish a moment of invitation, though. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. Right now counts forever. What you do in these moments of invitation, they matter for eternity. And I hope and pray you'll think about that. Let's stand and sing about it.